Good morning. So we're looking at the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, Code of Jewish Law, chapter 475. I think we're at halacha 27.
25.
Did we do 25 and 26 yesterday? I believe we did.
Yeah, 25. Not sure about
We
26.
began, I think
Yeah,
we
we
did,
did both.
yeah, we did 25 and 26. We're at
Yeah.
27. So what we learned so far is with matzah, the issue is consumption. With maror, the issue is taste. Therefore, with maror, one is required to chew to the point that the flavor of bitterness is experienced. When it comes to matzah, excuse me, when it comes to matzah, what's required is to consume. And consuming begins in the throat, and therefore the matzah has to go down the throat. Meaning, if a person didn't chew it, just swallow it directly, that's okay. But if they swallowed it wrapped in something else, then it wouldn't be okay because that would create a barrier. That would create a barrier between the matzah and the throat. If the person swallowed matzah and maror together, then the obligation of matzah will have been fulfilled because there was consumption. The obligation of maror will not have been fulfilled because there's no taste. And the issue of maror as a food item, canceling matzah as a food item, is only when there's chewing involved. But considering there's no chewing here, so there was no maror flavor, so it doesn't cancel the matzah flavor, and therefore the swallowing matzah is good, but the maror itself is no good because there was no chewing. That's what we learned yesterday. Okay, so look at 27.
I just like to take something into just you take a piece of matzah, you just swallow it, you
Yeah.
don't choke. So you throw up,
Okay,
you throw it out. Is the mitzvah complete?
The question of whether someone regurgitated matzah and maror and whether they fulfill the obligation is a different subject. It's a good one. As far as the question of choking, these are all hypotheticals in the Gemara, in the halacha here. We follow the Haggadah, do what it says to do, and you'll be fine. But the halacha is structured again to fulfill all the requirements here, right? So these are the requirements upon which the Haggadah is built. And as far as choking on matzah, we today, in our days where we have matzah being baked, I don't know, 1500 degrees, where it gets baked in a couple of seconds and it's a thin, flat cracker, that's our version of matzah, so that it's the highest form possible of kosher matzah. The basic halacha requirement doesn't have to be that way. Basic halacha requirement could be thin, soft matzah, that's almost like pita bread, which you can very easily swallow one olive-sized portion of that without choking, right? So it doesn't have to be the matzah that you and I are used to. And even the matzah that you and I are used to, in theory, a person can crumble up an olive-sized portion, make it wet, and swallow it like a pill.
So let's put it another way. Somebody takes the piece of matzah, coughs, goes down, comes right out. Does he have to make another?
Okay, in that case, the person didn't even swallow it. Okay, the question of regurgitation is not for now. We're just discussing the halacha of swallowing.
Just stay telling.
Okay, 27. Va'afilu im hamarar karuch sviv hamatzah. Even if the person took the maror itself and wrapped it around the matzah. So there, right before we said that if the matzah is wrapped, if something's wrapping around the matzah, then that's no good because it creates a barrier between the matzah and the throat. Here he's using the maror to wrap around the matzah. So his matzah is completely enclosed or encased in the maror. The nimtza, so the result is the matzah creates a barrier between, the maror creates a barrier between the matzah and his, what they translate as pharynx. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but essentially the throat, which is the swallowing mechanism in the mouth. No problem. This does not constitute a barrier between matzah and his throat. Why? Earlier we said there is if you wrapped it in a leaf, then it would constitute a barrier. Here, the maror doesn't cause a barrier. Why is that? It explains, because both the maror and the matzah are food items. Hareim kemin echad, and therefore they are considered of one substance. Min b'minoi enei one substance of the other substance that are both the same type don't constitute a barrier. A barrier is only when there's something of an external material. And like he explains in footnote 109, since both matzah and maror are food, the maror is considered as an entity of the same type as matzah. The principle stated here that an entity is never considered as an intervention relative to another entity of its type, mentioned in various other sections and other types. So in other words, like this, let's just say, whenever you swallow matzah alone, right? Or let's say you had swallow matzah alone. Does every part of your matzah touch your throat? Not necessarily. There are certain parts of the matzah that are in the middle that don't. Yet we consider it as having gone through your throat and having you swallowed it properly. Why is that? Because it's not wrapped in an external element. It's all food. So the whole food goes down. It's wrapped in and of itself. So that idea of it being wrapped in and of itself and therefore not constituting a barrier extends to all food items.
Which are considered same type.
Same type. So if you wrapped matzah inside your maror and swallowed it, you will fulfill your obligation for matzah, but not maror because you didn't chew the maror. Right? And therefore, if you wrap the matzah in a, here he translated as a palm bast. It's a kind of leaf. Ubala and then swallowed it. La yotza, he hasn't fulfilled the obligation. Shasiv, because this leaf, she'ein bin meichel, is not considered a food type. Is considered a separation and a barrier between the matzah and my swallowing apparatus. What's it called again? Pharynx. This is not considered eating, and therefore it's considered a barrier. Okay, now we get to, excuse me just for a moment. Apologies. Okay, now we get to the question. Sorry?
That needs to be Rabbi?
I'm taking already.
Okay.
Clearly needs stronger. Anyway, halacha 28. Now we get to the question of matzah with intentionality. So let's remember this. I mentioned this yesterday. This is a massive subject in halacha, which we touched upon a little bit in our Gemara, which is mitzvahs tzrichas kavana. Do mitzvahs require intentionality? Intentionality here, we don't mean the spiritual intention of the meaning behind the mitzvah. That's not what we mean here. We mean the basic awareness that I'm fulfilling a mitzvah. So I don't know if there's a mitzvah, but I happen to pick up my little vanessek and hold them together. Did I do the mitzvah or not? I didn't know it was a mitzvah today. What's that? We're looking at here.
No.
Oh, the leaf that we're talking about. Yeah. So I don't know that there's a mitzvah little vanessek, but I put it together. I'm hungry. Right? So I don't know there's a mitzvah, but I put the little vanessek together. I'm hungry. It happens to be a Seder night, and I eat matzah because I'm hungry. Then I do the mitzvah. I'm walking by the park, and I hear a shofar being sounded. Oh, that's a nice sound. No intention to do the mitzvah. Did I do the mitzvah or not? Right. So this is the question of sorry.
You heard it.
Okay, so this is the question: do mitzvahs require intentionality? Mitzvahs tzrichas kavana. So again, intentionality means do I have to be aware that I'm performing a mitzvah at the moment? And what degree of awareness do I have to have? So the general principle is, as we learned, although this is disputed, and we discussed this a bit in the Gemara, but the general principle is, when it comes to biblical mitzvahs, you are required to have some intentionality, otherwise no mitzvah is performed. When it comes to rabbinic mitzvahs, one is not required to have intentionality, and if a person performed it just because, then they fulfilled the mitzvah. That's the general principle. As we're going to see here, it's not so simple, because there are contradicting statements throughout the Talmud, or seemingly contradicting statements, and reconciling these seemingly contradicting statements, you have to carve out some sort of logic that works universally to explain all these various different statements.
Like the concept of mass evolution.
Yeah, and it's abstraction.
Abstraction.
Yeah, here this is the most legal basic requirement,
Right.
in judiciary law, you have manslaughter versus first degree murder.
Right.
Okay, death is a death. But intentionality changes what kind of death, what kind of legal death do we consider this? Right? Is it manslaughter, is it first degree murder, second degree murder? That's all a question of intentionality. So this is a legal question of what degree of intentionality am I required to have in order to have fulfilled my obligation to perform the mitzvah? Right? So you have to take all the different statements in the Talmud and then try to like carve out some sort of universal rationale that fits them all. Some kind of common denominator that explains all these various different seemingly disparate statements. And one of these questions comes down to matzah, as we'll see momentarily, because on the one hand, matzah is a biblical mitzvah, which seems to imply, as the principle we stated earlier, it does require intentionality. On the other hand, the Gemara seems to be saying that even if someone forced me to eat matzah, I will fulfill my obligation. Now, if I was forced, it means I didn't have an intentionality. So what's going on? So let's see how we understand this. Halacha Chav Ches, Halacha 28. Again, this is the tip of the iceberg, and we're just getting what the Alter Rebbe says, but there's so much that goes behind these lines and so much written on the paragraph we're about to read. Halacha 28. Achal matzah b'le kavana. If a person ate matzah without intention, meaning he had no intention of fulfilling the mitzvah with this eating. He did it because he was hungry. Seder night, he's hungry, so he eats matzah without any intention of fulfilling the mitzvah at the moment. Says the halacha, yatsa, he fulfilled his obligation. This is based on our Gemara. Okay? Sorry?
Very clear.
So far, so clear. Even though we said it's a biblical mitzvah, and biblical mitzvahs, we said as a rule, require intention. But nonetheless, here we say you do fulfill your obligation. Now, v'lo amru,
They didn't say the bracha.
he didn't say the bracha. Again, bracha is not mitzvah.
No.
Bracha is not mitzvah, right? Bracha is a thank you for the mitzvah, but the mitzvah itself is the act that follows the bracha. In this case, the matzah eating. So the person did not make a bracha, no. Ate matzah because he was hungry. Fulfilled his obligation because he did the mitzvah, performed the act. Now, as for the statement that all mitzvahs that were done without intent, without the intent to fulfill the obligation, meaning that he did not intend to fulfill his obligation in this act. And we said that the person doesn't fulfill his obligation if he does that. So he does the act without any intention. He doesn't fulfill his obligation. So it's sukkahs in the morning. He picks up lulav and Esther, calls them together. He had no intention to do the mitzvah. The halacha is he did not do the mitzvah, and he has to do it again with intention to fulfill the mitzvah. So how does that jive with what we just said? That when eating matzah, you fulfill your obligation even without intent. They're both biblical mitzvahs, sukkah, lulav and matzah. Why is it different? So all of that is only said, Ella the mitzvah she'em b'em hanas haguf klal. Those are the kind of mitzvahs. That rule applies to the kind of mitzvahs for which the body has no enjoyment. Going, for example, Kriya Shema, the reading of Shema. If I am reading the Shema because I am a scribe and I'm checking the integrity of the Torah scroll, and in so doing, I read the Shema. So what's my intention here? Not to fulfill the mitzvah of reading Shema. It's to fulfill my obligation to make sure the Torah scroll is kosher. So the halacha is I did not fulfill my obligation. Unless before I got to the Shema part of my checking, I said, you know what, I had in mind, I'm going to read this now with the intention of fulfilling the obligation. Now, the mitzvah of saying Shema, the body gains nothing. So I require intentionality. I'm fulfilling the mitzvah now.
I guess you could try to define what it means by enjoyment. It doesn't,
Yes, there you go.
It doesn't only mean food, right?
Okay, let's see. That's a good question. That's correct. How far do you expand this? That's a very good question. Correct. Correct. You can see how much, when you make principles that go across the board, you have to go through each case and say, okay, how do I categorize it? Becomes a whole exercise. That's correct. Right. But so here he gives 3 examples of mitzvahs that have no enjoyment to the body. 1, reading the Shema. Number 2, tkiyah shofar, the sounding of the shofar. So here, you better enjoy the music of it. But it's not enjoyment to the body in the sense that I haven't consumed anything. And likewise, the tilas lulav, the taking of the lulav and Esther, there's no bodily gain. So in those instances, intentionality is required. And the like. If he did these things without the intention of fulfilling the mitzvah. So I listened to the shofar in the park because I thought it sounded nice. I picked up a lulav and esrog in the morning just because I was checking it out, and I read the Shema because I was checking the Torah scroll to make sure it's kosher. In those cases, like mitzvah klal, you have not fulfilled your obligation. I'm only misasik means like I'm only doing it happenstance, and therefore it doesn't count as fulfilling a mitzvah. Therefore, the act of doing that doesn't constitute doing a mitzvah, performing a mitzvah. It's just happening in happenstance. I happen to be reading the Shema. I happen to have heard the shofar. I happen to have picked up a lulav and esrog. But mitzvahs that are dependent on eating, see, the Alter Rebbe defines what does it mean, the bodily enjoyment. It means literally consumption, not listening to the sound of the shofar.
Not benefit to the body, but
Actual consumption. Going, for example, Pesach, the obligation to eat the Pesach offering. Matzah or maror creates ben, eating a matzah, eating a maror, and the like. Because there is actual derived benefit and satisfaction to the body. Even though I had no intention of fulfilling my obligation while eating this matzah, I ate it because I was hungry. He fulfilled his obligation for eating matzah.
I wonder why it's a requirement to have a benefit to the body.
Sorry?
Wonder what's the reasoning for the benefit to the body as an exception?
Whether he's aware of it or not, his body enjoys that food. Therefore, we can call that eating. Which means he fulfilled the mitzvah of eating. No, it comes down to like this.
If the mitzvah's eating, then that makes sense.
Exactly. So in other words, that was like this. What is the problem with a mitzvah that doesn't have intentionality? What's missing? What's the problem? The issue is what he called here, it's considered as if he is, they translate here as casual activity. I'm doing it nonchalantly. I nonchalantly happen to be doing that thing.
No mens rea.
That's right.
It's only
Misasik ba'alma means I'm only just doing it nonchalantly. But if there is a literal impact on me that I have, it's not a nonchalant action. Chewing and swallowing matzah is not nonchalant, even if I'm not intending to do the mitzvah. Picking up lulav and esrog and having a look at it is a nonchalant activity.
Your mind could be.
The shofar is a nonchalant activity because it has no material measurable impact. So the measure of the impact of that act is only in the intention. Whereas when it comes to eating food, the measure of that activity is not in the intention. It's on whether my body consumed the food. And therefore, if I consume the food, I did an act of consuming it. The mitzvah was done. But if there's no...
You can't separate...
Correct. Putting on tefillin, what's the impact of... What's the measurable impact of putting on tefillin? Not the spiritual impact. The measurable, like legal impact of putting on tefillin. Nothing other than my intention to put it on. But the measure... Right, but you're making a spiritual argument. Make a halachic argument. A legal argument. Right? It's very legal. Put on like your legal glasses. There's a legally define the activity. How do we legally define the measurable action of putting on tefillin? Tefillin on, off, my arm stays the same from a legal, perspective. The only measure of that act is my awareness that I did the mitzvah. So I have to have the awareness, otherwise there was no act done. So the problem of lack of intention in a mitzvah is not just not that the act was done, but we're lacking intention. It's as if the act was never done, because the entire definition of that act is the intention to do the act. But when it comes to eating, there is a quantifiable, measurable activity that was achieved even without my intention. My body consumed the food. This is a chiddush of the Alter Rebbe here in understanding the question of mitzvahs tzrichas kavanah. Why do mitzvahs require intentionality? Explains the Alter Rebbe because otherwise we have no legal definition for that activity unless there's intention. When it comes to eating food, there's a measurable legal definition for that action even without intention. Your body consumed matzah.
The body's getting benefit.
Because the body consumed matzah. Therefore, that is considered an act of eating. So we have a quantifiable measure for that action, and therefore it was done. When it comes to hearing shofar, How do we qualify this action from before and after in this person? Nothing happened unless he intentionally thought, I'm doing a mitzvah. So the entire measure is in its intentionality. Because when it comes to eating, the measure of the action is not the intentionality. It's on whether my body consumed those materials. And it did.
The only thing I don't understand is the difference between the robbers telling him to eat the matzah and he's fulfilled the obligation. God told us to put on tefillin. So whether the intent is there or not, he told us to do it.
Good question. So this is what the Alter was telling us. That act is not an act unless you thought of it. Otherwise, it wasn't an act. It was just a nonchalant happenstance. There was no performance of any obligation unless you're aware that you're doing that. Because we have no quantifiable measurable for that act.
You have tefillin, you know.
Right, but there's no quantifiable measure from before and after on the impact of that activity on a physical level, unless you are aware I'm doing it now.
So
That's the measure of that intent of that action. It's a very subtle concept here, and I acknowledge that freely.
You have
But
to
we
be
have to
aware of
understand.
it because
Sorry?
you're wrapping it.
You
You have to be aware of what you're doing.
Sorry,
You have to be aware of what you're doing when you put on the tefillin.
not necessarily. I'm half spaced out, and someone does it to me. Someone puts it on for me.
a mentally challenged person is not required to put on. When I say mentally challenged, someone that doesn't have that awareness.
It's completely exempt.
Exempt, but not for eating matzah.
Good question. I don't know. Good question. Good question. It's a very good question. Very good question. I understand that there's a subtle concept here, and I'm freely acknowledging that, but we have to understand what Dr. was saying. In other words, the exercise here is, let's try to understand what he's saying, right? Let's try to understand what he's saying. Let's try to see if we can get definition for it, right? We need to have a legal measure of what you've done, right? And if there's no change in the physical realm from before to after that mitzvah, that means the entirety of that mitzvah rests upon your intentionality.
It must.
It must, because there's no other measure for that activity.
Like your example of homicide as opposed to manslaughter.
Right. Even though, exactly, the distinction between first degree murder, second degree murder, or manslaughter, or homicide is not in the material. Because the material is the same thing. It's a dead guy with a bullet in his head. The legal measure is completely an intent. In other words, when all things physical remain the same, we only have intent to look at. So when it comes to mitzvahs that have no material change, we have to look at intent to make it into an act, to make it into a mitzvah. When there is a measurable physical change, my body consumed food, I don't require intentionality because I have a physical, measurable action that was done, which is the eating. But not physical action. I have a measurable physical result.
Physical result
of that action.
The action was harder for me to grasp
Because the action was done. You're right. Because I think that's where you're getting caught up. Because the lulav, the example he gives you the lulav, the act was done. The lulav and that should put together, but there's no measurable physical result of that action, other than the fact that I have intent to do it. Whereas when it comes to matzah, there is. Let's see. We can let's finish the paragraph. And I want to read footnote 115, which might help more. Sorry, again.
Or physical enhancement.
Maybe a physical enhancement, yeah. Right. So when physical enhancements fail, we must rely on intentionality to turn that act into a mitzvah. But where there is physical result, you don't need to rely on action to make it into a mitzvah. The physical result tells you it was done. Let's put it that way. Yeah, I'm talking it out with you, getting more clarity as I'm talking it, and you can see why there was hundreds of pages written on this. Right, to understand exactly what he's saying here and try to apply it to each and every mitzvah. It's very nuanced. Let's see the last paragraph, and then I'll read footnote 115. Therefore, last paragraph of 28. Yeah. Even if the person did not want to eat matzah, never mind. He had no. See, the example I've been giving till now is a person's hungry and he eats it because he's hungry, without the intention for matzah. Here he's pushing it even further. The person didn't want to eat matzah. And non-Jews or robbers, like you were saying, forced them to eat the matzah, compelled him. He fulfilled his obligation with that eating. Because against his will, his body still derived benefit. There's a measurable impact on his body of that mitzvah, whether you liked it or not. Thus, the mitzvah was done. There's a caveat which we're going to learn on Monday.
But regurgitation question may come up here.
Yeah, okay, maybe we'll get to that. But
No
Um,
benefit to the body.
say again.
No real benefit to the body.
Yeah.
Maybe there is. I don't know.
Yeah, your
Right,
question
but-
of the person who's mentally challenged might come up soon as well. Okay, we'll wait. We'll go forward.
Yeah.
But what was he going to say? What were we going to say?
We were working on that last piece, right? We didn't fulfill his
Oh, I was
need.
going to say we're going to learn a caveat on Monday that he has to be aware that tonight is Pesach, and that the mitzvah exists. He just wasn't thinking about the mitzvah in this action. Okay, we'll get to that on Monday and why that is. Let's look at footnote 115 and we'll close at that and we'll continue on Monday. 115, it's a longer footnote. Ravad, or Ravid. Yeah, you see it there, 115? I'm sorry, the text is a bit small. Yeah, zoom in. Footnote 115. Oh, what just happened? I lost my screen.
What's this?
Yeah, it's all right. I want to pull up the screen for our viewers. Oh, here we are. Okay. What's there? Sorry. Up a little bit. My apologies. What's there? Okay, here we are. Ravid, in his commentary to Rif, Psachim 25a, derives this concept as follows. One who sounds or hears a shofar as a casual activity, right? He's not intentional. He's just hearing it because he's walking down the park and he hears. He says, that's nice. Without intending to fulfill the mitzvah of sounding or hearing the shofar, does not fulfill his obligation to do so, as per Rosh Hashanah 32b. Nevertheless, one who partakes of forbidden fats, chelav, which is forbidden, or engages in forbidden intimacy as a casual activity without intending to transgress, a prohibition is liable. So why is a person liable for committing a transgression when he did not intend to transgress? And yet when it comes to the mitzvah, you didn't do the mitzvah even if you didn't intend to it. Like they should seem to be equal. Follow?
Mhm.
Seemingly the mitzvah should be the inverse of transgression. If transgression is done even without intentionality, a mitzvah should also be done without intentionality. Why is it?
Because
Why?
it relates to the benefit of the body.
Oh, so Ravid
That's the
explained.
common denominator.
Ravid explains that the person is liable because he derived physical satisfaction from the forbidden act.
Mhm.
So,
His
so
culpability should probably be at a lesser standard, obviously.
maybe, but nonetheless,
Right?
that sin is
He'll bring-
done.
He'll bring a hot pass offering.
The
for
sin,
this.
that's right. The sin
As
is
opposed
done.
to having carrots or something.
Maybe, but the sin is done.
Yeah. No.
Yeah. Similarly, when a person performs the activity associated with a mitzvah without intending to perform the mitzvah, the activity leads to physical satisfaction. The person is considered to fulfill his obligation if it did lead to physical satisfaction. Matzah. On this basis, we can understand the difference between the recitation of the Shema or the sounding of the shofar and eating matzah. If a person recites Shema or sounds or listens to the shofar without intent to fulfilling the mitzvah, the words he recited or the sounds he makes or hears have no importance whatsoever and do not lead to any physical satisfaction. As our sages say, they are merely a casual activity, misasik. Right? Because again, the only measurable impact of that mitzvah
Intent.
is in the intent. When one eat matzah without intending to fulfill the mitzvah to eat matzah, however, it cannot be said that he did not eat. For as Alter Rebbe says, his throat derived satisfaction. We cannot call that act a casual act. We cannot call that act misasik, an act that happens nonchalantly. There's an impact, physical one we can measure. Thus, regardless of his intent, the person is considered to fulfill the mitzvah. Nevertheless, for the person to fulfill his obligation to observe the mitzvah, he must be at least aware that there is a mitzvah to eat matzah on Pesach night and that he is eating matzah on Pesach night. For only when he knows that he's doing the act that is necessary to fulfill the mitzvah is his act considered significant, regardless of his lack of intent. This is the next section, 29, which we'll address Monday, because it throws a wrench into this nuance. then it's true that without intent, it's still considered an action because there's a measurable satisfactory impact physically of the mitzvah. But that satisfaction is only considered valuable if the person's aware that such a mitzvah exists.
This is where brachas come into play. They help us to
Be aware you're doing a
form
mitzvah.
that intent or awareness.
On its most basic level, it's to be aware that you're doing a mitzvah. Because as we're going to learn tomorrow, there is,
Helps to fulfill the mitzvah
Yes.
in its proper fashion.
that's right, because as we're going to learn on Monday, based on our Gemara, there is an opinion which says that even now, even rabbinic mitzvahs require intent, right? There was an opinion in the Gemara that said that Mara requires intent, right? We ruled in the end that rabbinic mitzvahs don't require intent, but that was a machlekes, that was a dispute in the Gemara with respect to Mara. So certainly you want to be able to fulfill that obligation as well, and at least have some basic level of intent. I'm doing a mitzvah now, and that's on the most basic rudimentary level, the point of the bracha. To be aware of performing a mitzvah. Okay, it was somewhat nuanced, as you can clearly see, and obviously there's much written about this to try to exactly. Also, you can see how there's a contradictory statements in the Talmud. On the one hand, like Rabbi points out, no intentionality, you still did the sin. On the other hand, no intentionality, no mitzvah. On the other hand, matzah, yes, mitzvah.
So there's qualifiers.
So there's qualifiers to all these things. You have to like carve out some sort of logic that explains
For each.
all of these things. And the logic out there was giving it, at least as the way we're understanding it is there a physical material measure of the impact of that activity? If there is, then that's what's going to constitute the activity. If there isn't, then we have to rely on your intent to turn that act from casual happenstance to a mitzvah.
And that's the question we ask for each. So
Sorry?
that's the question we ask ourselves. I guess what you just said. We ask ourselves for each in substance for that, just to see which is the general
right.
rule exactly.
Exactly. Okay, wonderful day with Ner Shabbos,
Very much.
and God willing, we'll continue more on Monday.
Shabbos, Rabbi. Thank you.
Good day.
So talking about the